What a joke, you really think I'm one of your punchlines? That's how the night started. A laugh that cut cleaner than a knife and landed squarely on me. My sister, the one who always had the perfect smile for the cameras and the loudest laugh at my expense, handed me a little white box like it was a party favor, like it was nothing. "Happy birthday, Grace," she said, grinning, the kind of grin that meant she already had everyone on her side. Everyone laughed. I smiled because I always did. That's what I had been trained to do my whole life. Smile while they rearranged the world around me. People might expect me to stand up, to storm out, to make the scene. I didn't. I sat. I opened the box. A DNA test kit, plastic swab. A QR code that led to someone else's promise of truth. She laughed and made a show of it, the little head tilt, the whisper to Mom, the camera phone raised like a judge's gavel. Humiliation was apparently on the menu and she'd brought the appetizer. But here's what no one ever seemed to notice about me: I don't get loud, I don't need to, I don't require the spotlight to be dangerous. My power is a slow thing, it's quiet, it's the kind of tide that doesn't announce itself until the shoreline is already gone. I swallowed my anger like a medicine and let it sit heavy in my chest. That's a strange thing for people to misunderstand about me. They think calm equals weak. They call it too nice, too soft, too eager to please. They never guess that all that niceness is strategy. It's a mask I perfected when I was small and the world was full of bigger voices. You learn quick that the louder you are, the easier you are to pin, so I learned to be still. I took notes. I watched reactions like a scientist records experiments. I kept receipts in my head, not on paper. I was smart about where I spent myself. The kit sat on the table for a moment like an accusation. My sister kept smiling, predatory, satisfied. The rest of the room blinked around her punchline, waiting for me to crumple. But I didn't. I didn't give them the show they wanted. Instead, I asked a casual question just loud enough for the room to hear. "You sure you want me to take it now?" That tiny pause, that tiny question, got them leaning forward. It's amazing how much people reveal when they think someone else will do the falling for them. I remember my father then, half-remembered toasts and receipts of affection. He'd always had this private way of looking at me like I was a small, odd puzzle he didn't feel like finishing in front of company. He favored my sister, sure, bows, big gestures, the loud prizes. But fathers are complicated and people are more complicated than their public faces. That seed of doubt, the one the DNA kit dug up, felt older than the plastic on the table. I didn't know yet which roots it would find. YouTube tip: if you want to follow this ride, hit subscribe and tap the bell. You won't want to miss what comes next. I don't say that like a salesperson. I say it like someone who's seen where this story goes and knows you'll want a front row seat. They waited for me to make a mistake. They were sure I'd implode. That laugh was an invitation for spectacle. My sister had built an audience and handed them the cue, but spectacle belongs to people who need it. I don't. I tucked that humiliation away like a ledger entry, like another fact on my long list. I walked out of the room with the kit in my pocket because I wanted it where I could look at it later, alone. Alone is where plans are born. At the end of the night, I lay awake and thought of inheritance not as money or titles, but as the legacy of how a family remembers itself. My father's shadow sat across that legacy like a landlord refusing to admit a tenant. What if the truth unraveled more than old hurts? What if it repainted history in colors nobody expected? That question felt dangerous and electric, and for the first time in a long while, I welcomed danger. I'm not a vindictive person by nature. I'm methodical. I'm patient. I let other people race to their own missteps while I learned the contours of the field. There's a warmth in watching a carefully stacked house of cards wobble because someone else thought they'd knocked it over by shaking the table. The humiliation they wanted to give me that night, the public giggle, the selfie with my face in the background, might have been their plan, but plans are fragile, people are fragile, and patience is underrated. Next. I'll tell you where I grew up, how we were raised, what it meant to be the quiet one in a family built on loud favorites, and how I started building my own life away from their spotlight. I grew up in a town so small the welcome sign doubled as the goodbye sign. One diner, one grocery store, one main street where everybody knew your business before you did. If you messed up, it followed you like a smell you couldn't wash out. If you succeeded, people pretended it was luck or family connections, anything but your own work. Our house sat on the edge of town, white siding that yellowed faster than we could repaint it. Inside, everything revolved around my sister. Her trophies lined the shelves, her photos crowded the fridge, her stories dominated the dinner table. If she sneezed, the room stopped. If I spoke, conversations gently stepped over me like I was furniture. My parents didn't mean to be cruel. That's the excuse people always give them. They were practical. They invested where they saw returns. My sister was loud, confident, charming, the kind of kid adults found easy to love. I was quieter. I asked too many questions. I preferred books to applause. So I became the background daughter, the one you forgot to count when you did head counts. At school, teachers praised her leadership. They told me I was reliable. That word followed me everywhere. Reliable means invisible with a smile. Reliable means you'll handle things without recognition. Reliable means nobody worries about you because they assume you'll manage. And I did. I managed myself into a corner where no one thought to look too closely. Money was always tight, but somehow there was always enough for my sister's needs. New outfits, travel teams, private lessons. When I wanted something, I learned to phrase it like a question that already knew the answer was no. Eventually, I stopped asking. I started figuring things out on my own. I babysat, I tutored, I fixed neighbors' computers back when that felt like magic. I saved every dollar quietly like I was building a life underground. My father was the most complicated piece of the puzzle. He wasn't unkind, just distant, a man who treated emotions like expenses you could trim from the budget. He rarely defended me, but sometimes when he thought no one was watching, he'd ask me questions that felt different. About my grades, about what I liked to read, about what I wanted to do one day. He never followed up. Still, those moments stuck with me like bookmarks in a story I hadn't finished reading. When I left town, nobody threw me a party, no big send-off. My sister's departure years earlier had been an event, balloons, speeches, tears. Mine was a quiet goodbye in the driveway. Mom hugged me, Dad nodded. My sister checked her phone. I drove away with everything I owned in the trunk and something sharp and steady settling into my chest, freedom mixed with resolve. In the city, I learned how to become someone without announcing it. I took jobs that taught me how systems worked, money systems, people systems, influence systems. I watched how power moved without raising its voice. I learned when to speak and when silence bought me more leverage. While my sister posted updates and milestones, I built foundations. No applause, no audience, just progress. The funny thing about being underestimated is that it gives you room to grow roots where no one's looking. By the time I was stable, not flashy, not famous, but solid, my family still thought of me as the sweet one who went off somewhere. They never asked for details. They never needed to. In their minds, the story was already written. So when my sister laughed and handed me that DNA kit years later, she wasn't just mocking me in the moment. She was standing on a lifetime of assumptions that I was fragile, that I needed approval, that I would crumble if embarrassed publicly. She believed the past defined the future. What she didn't understand was that my past didn't make me weak. It trained me. It taught me how to survive quietly, how to plan without witnesses, how to let other people reveal themselves while I stayed unreadable. That DNA kit wasn't just a joke. It was a spark dropped onto ground that had been dry for decades. And sparks don't care how small the town is. Next, I'll tell you about the first crack in our family story, the thing I noticed long before the DNA results came back, and why it suddenly mattered more than anyone realized. Long before the DNA results ever crossed my mind, there was something about our family story that never quite sat right with me. It wasn't dramatic, no shouting matches, no locked doors. Just small inconsistencies, the kind people dismiss because it's easier than asking questions that might ruin dinner. It started with photographs. Every family has albums. Ours were heavy, leather-bound things my mother guarded like heirlooms. Birthdays, holidays, school events, my sister appeared in all of them like she was the main character in a very well-lit movie. I was there too sometimes, but always off to the side. Cropped, half-hidden, easy to overlook. But there was one stretch of time, about a year, where something felt edited. Photos jumped from my mother pregnant with me straight to me as a toddler, no hospital pictures, no newborn shots. No framed announcement like my sister had. I asked once casually when I was a teenager. My mother waved it off. "We were busy," she said, "busy enough to forget cameras existed, in a family that documented everything." It didn't add up, but I learned early that pushing questions only made adults defensive. So I stored it away. Then there were the comments. Neighbors would say things like, "You don't really look like your sister, do you?" Or "You must take after someone else in the family." People laughed when they said it like it was harmless. My sister loved those moments. She'd grin and say, "Yeah, she's the odd one out." Everyone chuckled. I smiled. Inside, I filed the remark under unresolved. My father added his own quiet contradictions. He never corrected people when they implied my sister was more his. But sometimes, unexpectedly, he'd defend me in subtle ways, not publicly, never in front of my sister. But if someone questioned my intelligence or minimized my ambitions, he'd step in with facts. Dry, precise facts. Like he was protecting something fragile without explaining why. The older I got, the more those inconsistencies lined up like dots no one else wanted to connect. After I moved away, I noticed how little my family asked about my life. They didn't seem curious. It was as if they preferred me frozen in time, the quiet, manageable version of me that didn't complicate their narrative. Meanwhile, my sister's updates were shared like headlines: promotions, relationships, wins. She was proof that everything in our family worked exactly as intended. Then came the night of the DNA kit. Once the laughter faded and I was alone with my thoughts, all those old moments resurfaced with new weight. The missing photos. The strange looks, my father's half-attention, my sister's confidence, not just confidence but certainty. Certainty that whatever that DNA test revealed would humiliate me, not her. That certainty bothered me more than the joke. I didn't rush to take the test. That surprised people when they found out later, but patience has always been my advantage. I wanted to understand the terrain before I moved, so instead I started making calls, quiet ones. Old family friends, former neighbors, people who remembered things but had never been asked directly. At first they were vague. That was a long time ago. Families are complicated. But when I framed my questions gently, when I made it clear I wasn't looking to accuse, only to understand, cracks formed. One woman paused too long before answering. Another corrected herself mid-sentence. A third said something that stuck with me. "Your mother went away for a bit, didn't she?" She had a rest. That's what I'd been told. A few months where my sister stayed with relatives and my father traveled more than usual. It had always been presented as ordinary stress. Now it sounded rehearsed. I realized something important then. The DNA test wasn't my sister's first move. It was just the loudest one. Whatever truth existed, she believed she controlled it. And people don't mock what they're uncertain about. They mock what they think is already decided. That realization shifted everything for me. This wasn't just about identity anymore. It was about power, who had it, who thought they had it, and who had been quietly building it in the background for years. I finally took the test that week. Not with fear, with clarity, because once you know a secret exists, it's only a matter of time before it chooses a side. Next, I'll tell you what I was building in secret while I waited for those results and why my sister never saw it coming. While the DNA kit traveled through labs and databases, my life kept moving, just not in ways my family bothered to notice. That's the advantage of being the low-maintenance one. No one checks on your trajectory because they assume it's flat. After I left town, I learned quickly that loud ambition attracts attention and attention attracts interference. So I did the opposite. I took positions that looked ordinary on paper but taught me how leverage actually works. I watched how money changes tone in a room. I watched how favors replace contracts. I learned how people behave when they think no one important is watching. I didn't chase titles. I chased access. I built relationships quietly, intentionally, the kind that don't show up on social media. While my sister curated an image, I curated information. While she collected applause, I collected patterns. I understood early that success doesn't always look like success from the outside. Sometimes it looks like stability, discretion, and optionality. By my early 30s, I was comfortable, not flashy. Comfortable in the way that lets you say no, comfortable in the way that makes emergencies inconvenient instead of devastating. I own my time, I own my silence, and most importantly, I own my curiosity. My family never asked how I afforded my life. They never asked what I actually did. That suited me just fine. People are far more honest when they assume you're irrelevant. During holidays, my sister would talk over me, correcting stories I told about my own life. She liked being the authority. She liked watching people nod when she spoke. I let her. Correcting her would have required explaining myself, and explanation is a form of permission. I didn't need permission. When the DNA test entered the picture, I didn't panic because I had something most people don't: contingency plans. I had already learned that identity, like money, is safest when diversified. Whatever that test said, I knew one thing: I wasn't dependent on my family's version of me to survive. Still, I prepared. I reviewed documents. Old letters, financial records I had access to for reasons no one had questioned at the time. I mapped timelines the way investigators do, calmly, without emotion. The gaps became obvious once I stopped treating them like accidents. And then there was my sister. People like her mistake dominance for control. She believed that because she'd always been louder, she'd always be ahead. She didn't realize that while she was performing confidence, I was building insulation. She assumed I wanted approval. In reality, I wanted clarity. When the DNA results finally came back, I didn't open them right away. That might sound strange, but timing matters. Truth is powerful, but only when you release it into the right environment. I waited until I understood exactly who would benefit from silence and who would collapse under it. In the meantime, I listened. I listened to my sister brag about the joke. I listened to relatives speculate about what the test would prove. I listened to my mother deflect questions with rehearsed warmth. I listened to my father say nothing at all. Silence, I've learned, is rarely empty. It's usually full of fear. By the time I opened the results, I wasn't looking for validation. I was looking for confirmation. And when I read them, I felt something unexpected: not shock, not relief, but alignment. Pieces slid into place like they'd been waiting years for permission. The truth didn't make me angry, it made me precise, because now I understood why my sister felt so safe laughing. Why she felt entitled to humiliate me publicly. Why she believed the family narrative would protect her no matter what. She thought the truth belonged to her. What she didn't know was that truth doesn't care who introduces it, only who controls the aftermath. Next, I'll tell you what the DNA test actually revealed and why it instantly turned my sister's confidence into a liability. The DNA results didn't scream, they didn't accuse. They didn't dramatize themselves the way people expect truth to do. They were quiet, clinical. Percentages and labels arranged neatly on a screen, as if this information hadn't just rearranged the architecture of my life. My sister and I were only half related, same mother, different fathers. I read it twice, then a third time slower, not because I didn't understand it, but because I wanted to be sure I wasn't projecting meaning where there was none. But the numbers were stubborn, clear, final. Suddenly that missing year in the photo albums made sense. The vague explanations, the neighbors' pauses, my father's strange mix of distance and protection. He hadn't been my biological father. And yet, he'd never treated me like a stranger either. What the test didn't say mattered just as much as what it did. It didn't say I was an outsider. It didn't say I didn't belong. It just said the story we'd all been fed was incomplete. Carefully edited, maintained by silence. I sat with that truth longer than most people would. I didn't call anyone, I didn't confront my mother, I didn't message my sister. Information like that is volatile. You don't throw it into a room unless you're ready for the fire. Instead, I kept digging. I ordered a second test through a different service. Same result, then a third, same again. Patterns don't lie, people do. And now I had enough confirmation to move from curiosity to strategy. Here's where things got interesting. My sister hadn't just gifted me a DNA test for laughs. She'd done it with intent. I realized that when I revisited old conversations with new context. She'd made comments over the years, subtle ones, about inheritance, bloodlines, real family. At the time, they'd sounded like arrogance. Now they sounded like rehearsal. She knew, or at least she suspected. And suspicion is dangerous when paired with entitlement. I started looking into my father's estate planning. Not through official channels. I already had legitimate access to certain documents from years earlier, thanks to favors done and trust earned quietly. I didn't alter anything. I didn't touch. I observed. That's when the second truth surfaced. My sister had been lying not just about me, about herself. There were discrepancies in financial records tied to accounts she'd managed temporarily while my father's health declined. Small amounts at first, easy to justify. Then larger transfers masked as reimbursements. Creative accounting, you might call it if you were feeling generous. She had assumed she was untouchable, assumed that being the real daughter meant scrutiny didn't apply to her. That assumption was her blind spot. What fascinated me wasn't the betrayal itself, families betray each other all the time, but her confidence. She laughed because she thought the DNA test would knock me out of the inheritance conversation entirely. She thought she was removing a variable, instead she'd handed me leverage. Because now I knew two things she didn't realize were connected, the truth about my parentage and the truth about her behavior. Separately, each was manageable. Together, they were combustible. I didn't want justice, I didn't want apologies, I didn't even want acknowledgement. I wanted imbalance, so I stayed quiet. I let my sister keep laughing, let her keep underestimating me. Let her believe the DNA test had already done its damage. People are reckless when they think the worst is over. And that recklessness creates opportunity. Before I moved another piece, I made one decision very clear to myself. I wasn't going to expose her in a courtroom or a headline. No police, no judges, no neat resolutions. That kind of accountability lets people frame themselves as victims of process. What I was planning was messier, more personal. A collapse that would happen in rooms full of people who used to trust her, slowly, undeniably, without sirens or handcuffs. The kind of ending you can't appeal. Next, I'll tell you how I began laying the groundwork, how I turned patience into a weapon and started guiding my sister exactly where I needed her to go. I didn't confront my sister, that's what she expected. Confrontation gives people a chance to rehearse their innocence. It lets them sharpen their excuses. I gave her neither. I gave her time. Time makes confident liars careless. I started by becoming useful again. That sounds harmless, and that's the point. I offered to help with things she'd grown tired of managing, schedules, introductions, a few loose ends connected to family matters. I framed it as gratitude. After everything Dad did for us, I said, carefully including myself in the sentence. She smiled, magnanimous. She loved an audience that applauded her generosity. She didn't ask why I was suddenly involved. She didn't ask what I already knew. People like her don't imagine the quiet ones returning with teeth. I listened, I watched, I let her talk. She bragged in small ways, the kind that slip out when someone feels safe. She complained about how complicated the finances had become. She hinted at how exhausting it was to be responsible for everything. She said things like, "You wouldn't understand," which is always an invitation to understand more. Every story she told had edges. I traced them. I learned who trusted her without question. I learned who felt uneasy but hadn't found a reason to say it out loud. I learned which rooms she dominated and which rooms tolerated her. Power, I've found, is rarely absolute. It's borrowed, renewed daily, and dependent on belief. I also learned something else. She was in a hurry. She wanted closure on the DNA situation. She wanted the family to move on, to cement the narrative that I was different, maybe even slightly embarrassing. She pushed for jokes at my expense, casual comments that framed the test as settled business. "Science confirmed what we always knew," she'd say with a laugh. I played along, I nodded, I let people believe I was bruised. Meanwhile, I began to plant questions, not accusations, questions. I'd ask an aunt if she remembered the year my mother went away. I'd ask a family friend how Dad liked things handled back then. I'd mention small inconsistencies as if I were trying to understand, not challenge. People corrected me. Then corrected themselves. Doubt doesn't need a megaphone, it just needs air. At the same time, I gently repositioned myself in conversations about legacy, not inheritance, legacy, stories, values, intent. I talked about my father in ways that made people remember him as thoughtful, deliberate, precise. A man who didn't like messes, a man who planned. That framing mattered. Because when people remember someone as intentional, they start questioning outcomes that look sloppy. My sister noticed the shift but misread it. She thought I was seeking sympathy. She thought I was trying to reattach myself emotionally now that blood had been clarified. That assumption made her generous in the wrong ways. She overexplained, she overreached. She left trails where there had once been fog. I didn't rush. I let months pass. I let her confidence grow fat and slow. I let her believe the worst thing that could happen had already happened to me. That's the secret people miss about revenge. The cruelest part isn't the strike, it's the wait. It's letting someone build their life on a foundation you've already hollowed out. By the time I was ready to move, I had something better than proof. I had consensus waiting to be born. All it needed was a moment, not a courtroom, not a headline, just the right room, the right story, and the right silence afterward. And my sister, she was already walking herself there, convinced she was leading. Next, I'll tell you about the event she insisted on hosting, the one that gave me the stage without ever realizing it, and how I set the trap so gently no one noticed until it closed. The invitation came dressed as generosity. My sister decided to host a family gathering, not a party exactly, more like a celebration of continuity, her words, said with that polished warmth she used when she wanted credit for being thoughtful. It was meant to honor our father's memory, his legacy, and quietly her role as the one holding everything together. A room full of people who already believed her version of events, a room where she was most powerful. She never considered that power only exists where no one questions it. The venue was tasteful, private, the kind of place where people lower their voices instinctively, like truth might echo too loudly if spoken carelessly. She planned the seating, she planned the speeches, she planned the mood. What she didn't plan for was me saying yes immediately when she asked if I'd attend. That gave her confidence. She even offered me a few words on the program, if you feel up to it. The phrasing was perfect. Benevolent, slightly pitying, I accepted without hesitation. I could see the narrative she imagined. The quiet sister standing up, saying something vague and emotional, proving she was still harmless. I spent the weeks before the event doing nothing dramatic. I didn't leak information. I didn't confront anyone. I let anticipation work on her instead of me. People underestimate how destabilizing patience can be when someone expects resistance. On the night of the gathering, my sister moved through the room like a host who believed the evening belonged to her. Laughter followed her, glasses clinked. She told the same curated stories about our father, always highlighting how much he relied on her, trusted her, leaned on her. Each story tightened the web she didn't realize she was standing in. When it was my turn to speak, the room softened. People expect vulnerability from someone they've already categorized as lesser. It makes them comfortable. I didn't start with the DNA test, that would have been crude, obvious. I started with gratitude, with memory, with small, true details about my father, things only someone who paid attention would know, the way he folded receipts, the way he checked locks twice, the way he believed clarity was kindness. I watched faces change, attention sharpened, then I shifted gently into uncertainty. I spoke about how families tell stories to survive, how sometimes those stories simplify things that were never simple. I mentioned how learning new information doesn't erase love, but it does demand honesty. No accusations, no names, just ideas. You could feel it then, the room leaning. I said something that sounded almost innocent. I used to think blood explained everything, now I know it explains very little. My sister smiled tightly. She thought she knew where I was going. She didn't. I talked about responsibility, about trust. About how the real measure of family isn't who inherits the spotlight, but who protects the integrity of what's been left behind. That word, integrity, landed differently. I saw it. A few people exchanged looks, not alarm. Recognition. I ended by thanking my sister publicly for carrying so much. That phrase did the real work, because everyone in the room knew carrying something too long changes the shape of it. I stepped away to applause, the polite kind, and let silence do what it does best. I didn't expose her that night, not directly. I didn't need to. What I did was fracture certainty. I turned confidence into discomfort. I planted the idea that the story they'd accepted might have been curated, and that someone else had been watching quietly the whole time. Before the night ended, I caught a few people looking at my sister differently, not with suspicion yet. With curiosity, and curiosity is where collapse begins. If you're still with me, make sure you're subscribed, because what happens next is where everything she built starts unraveling piece by piece. Next, I'll tell you how I followed that moment with precision, how I let others ask the questions I never had to voice, and how my sister realized far too late that the room was no longer hers. The most effective part of that night wasn't what I said, it was what I didn't correct afterward. In the days following the gathering, people began reaching out not to confront me but to check in. That's how doubt announces itself. Soft concern, casual curiosity, "You okay? That must have been a lot." Each question carried an unspoken follow-up. They were asking themselves, "What else don't we know?" I answered carefully, calm, grateful, never defensive. I never volunteered information, I never accused, I let people hear their own questions echoed in my pauses. Silence, when placed right, feels like confirmation. My sister noticed the shift immediately, she always did. She thrived on attention she could sense when it moved even an inch away from her. At first, she tried to reassert control the way she always had: jokes, reassurance, familiarity. She laughed louder, she told stories twice. She reminded people of how much she'd handled over the years, but confidence, when forced, reads like desperation. People began comparing notes without realizing it. Small inconsistencies surfaced, stories didn't align. Dates blurred, amounts changed. The people she'd relied on to never look too closely started looking closer, not because I asked them to, but because once trust cracks, curiosity rushes in to fill the gap. I stayed visible but neutral, present but unengaged. When asked directly, I said things like, "I'm still learning," or "I trust people will do what feels right." Those phrases sound harmless, they're not. They imply that judgment is ongoing and collective. My sister pulled me aside a week later. Her voice was controlled, but her eyes weren't. She asked what I was telling people. I told her the truth. Nothing. That answer unsettled her more than any accusation could have. You can defend against claims, you can't defend against absence. Then she made her mistake. She tried to rush resolution. She called a small meeting framed as transparency with a few key relatives and advisors. She talked fast, explained too much, clarified things no one had questioned out loud yet. In doing so, she connected dots for them. Watching it was almost painful. Almost. I wasn't invited to speak. I didn't ask to be. I attended quietly, took notes no one could see, and let her unravel herself. People interrupted her with questions she wasn't prepared for, not hostile questions, practical ones, the kind that assume cooperation and expose contradiction. By the end, the room felt different, not angry, wary. After that, things moved quickly without ever becoming loud. Invitations stopped coming, trust cooled, responsibilities were reassigned. People didn't accuse her of wrongdoing, they simply stopped relying on her. Influence doesn't vanish in explosions, it erodes. She started calling me more, texting, asking if I could help clear things up. The irony didn't escape me. I kept my responses brief, kind, delayed. The same way she'd treated me for decades. Here's the thing about cruel revenge that doesn't get talked about. The cruelty isn't in humiliation. It's in watching someone realize they're no longer believed and knowing there's no single moment they can point to and say, "That's when it went wrong." If you've made it this far, this is where the story tightens. Subscribe and stay with me, because the next part isn't about collapse anymore. It's about consequence. My sister still thought she could recover. Still believed she could negotiate her way back into control. She hadn't realized yet that the room had moved on without her, and that the inheritance she'd assumed was secure was already changing shape. Next, I'll tell you how it finally ended between us, the moment she understood what she'd lost and why quiet strength leaves no appeal. The end didn't come with shouting. There was no dramatic confrontation, no slammed doors, no final speech where I spelled out what she'd done wrong. That would have given her something to argue with, something to rewrite later. What she got instead was realization. It happened quietly, in a way that only someone like her would truly feel. She called me one afternoon and asked if we could meet. Her voice was careful now, stripped of its usual performance. Not weak, just unsure. That alone told me everything. Power doesn't disappear, it migrates. And she could feel it wasn't hers anymore. We met at a cafe halfway between our homes. Neutral ground, no audience. She talked first. She always did when she was nervous. She spoke about stress, about misunderstandings, about how people had suddenly changed. She framed everything as unfortunate timing, bad luck, other people being dramatic. She never once asked me how I was. At some point, she mentioned the inheritance, not directly, but in the abstract. Dad would have wanted things handled responsibly, she said, watching my face for a reaction. I nodded, calm, agreeable. That nod landed harder than any argument, because for the first time she wasn't sure what I knew or what I could influence. Then she asked the question she'd been circling the entire time. "Are you angry at me?" I didn't answer right away. I looked at her, really looked at her, and saw someone who had built her entire sense of safety on being untouchable, on being believed by default, on being the obvious choice. Losing that hadn't broken her yet, but it had hollowed something out. "I'm not angry," I said finally. "I'm clear." That was the moment it hit her. Clarity is terrifying to people who survive on confusion. I told her I didn't plan to fight her. I didn't need to. I wasn't interested in proving anything. I said I trusted the family to do what felt right, given everything they now understood. Those words weren't threats. They were acknowledgments of reality, of momentum. She tried to laugh it off, the old reflex, but it didn't land. She could feel the shift. She asked if I was going to say anything else. I shook my head. There was nothing left to say. When we stood to leave, she hesitated. She looked smaller somehow, not because I'd humiliated her, but because the world had stopped reinforcing her story, and without that reinforcement, she didn't know who she was. In the weeks that followed, things finalized themselves without ceremony. Responsibilities were redistributed. Decisions were made collectively instead of through her. The inheritance didn't disappear for her, but it no longer revolved around her. And for someone who'd built her identity on centrality, that was the real loss. As for me, I didn't gain a spotlight. I didn't want one. What I gained was recognition without noise, belonging without permission. A quiet acknowledgement from people who finally understood that I hadn't been absent, I'd been patient. The DNA test didn't erase my father from my life. If anything, it clarified him. He chose me every day he showed up, regardless of biology. That choice mattered more than blood ever could. The moral is simple, even if the path wasn't. Never underestimate the person who stays calm while being underestimated. Quiet strength doesn't announce itself. It waits. It works. And when it moves, it doesn't need to destroy, it just rearranges reality until the truth has no place left to hide. Next, I'll take you deeper into what happened after the dust settled, how the family dynamic truly changed, and how my sister tried unsuccessfully to reclaim what she thought she'd lost. After that cafe meeting, something subtle but irreversible set in, not peace, adjustment. Families don't heal the way movies suggest. They reorganize, they learn new habits, they stop saying certain names as often. They start choosing different seats at the table. My sister didn't disappear, that would have been too clean. She stayed in the orbit but no longer at the center. Invitations became conditional, conversations shortened. Decisions that once ran through her now took longer routes, deliberately avoiding her input. No one announced the change, they just behaved differently, and behavior is the only truth that sticks. She tried to adapt, I'll give her that. At first, she leaned into charm again, handwritten notes, thoughtful gestures, casual check-ins framed as concern. It might have worked if trust hadn't already shifted. But charm without authority feels transactional, and people sense when kindness is being used as currency. Then she tried competence. She offered help where it wasn't requested, provided explanations no one asked for. Corrected details that didn't matter. It only highlighted how much control she'd lost. The more she tried to reclaim relevance, the more obvious it became that relevance was no longer hers to claim. I stayed consistent. That was important. I didn't gloat, I didn't retreat. I showed up when invited. I contributed when asked. I listened more than I spoke. That steadiness did more damage to her position than any direct move ever could. Because now people had a comparison not between good and bad, but between calm and chaos. My mother struggled the most. She wanted equilibrium back. Mothers often do. She tried to smooth things over, to suggest misunderstandings, to encourage moving forward. I let her talk. I didn't argue. I didn't agree either. I told her I was fine, and I was. What she really wanted was for things to go back to how they were. That wasn't possible, and I didn't pretend otherwise. My father's absence felt heavier in those months, not because I needed his defense, but because his silence finally made sense. I understood now that some people choose quiet not out of indifference but out of guilt. And guilt, when unresolved, becomes architecture. It shapes entire families. My sister eventually confronted that truth in her own way. She sent me a message one night, not angry, not pleading, just tired. She said she felt like she'd lost something she couldn't name. I read it twice and didn't respond, not out of cruelty, out of respect for reality. Sometimes the kindest thing you can do is let someone sit with the consequences they've spent years avoiding. What surprised me was how little satisfaction I felt. The revenge wasn't in her discomfort, it was in my freedom. I no longer felt like I had to shrink to keep the peace. I didn't need to perform gratitude for scraps of validation. I didn't need to explain my worth in rooms where it had already been decided. That release, that quiet expansion, was the real inheritance. And here's the part no one warns you about: when you stop being underestimated, people start listening carefully. That changes how you have to carry yourself. Power, once recognized, demands restraint. I learned to use it sparingly. My sister still thought the story wasn't finished. She believed time would soften things, that familiarity would restore her position. She didn't understand that trust, once redistributed, doesn't return to its original shape. What she didn't know, what no one but me knew, was that one final thread from the past was still loose. Something small, something overlooked. And when it surfaced, it wouldn't humiliate her, it would define her. Next, I'll tell you about that last thread, the thing that ensured the family would never fully go back, and why some losses echo longer than others. The thing about people who build their power on being indispensable is that they ignore the small details. They focus on visibility, not structure. They assume that what isn't dramatic isn't dangerous. That's where my sister went wrong. There was one responsibility she'd taken on years ago, quietly, without ceremony, because no one else wanted the hassle. It wasn't glamorous, it didn't come with applause, it was administrative, historical. The kind of task people forget exists until something goes missing. Family records, not just finances, not just documents, stories, letters, old correspondences tied to my father's early years before he became the version everyone remembered. He'd asked my sister to organize them once when his health started to decline. She'd agreed casually, like it was beneath her but manageable, and then she treated it exactly like that. Boxes were moved, papers were sorted poorly. Some things were summarized instead of preserved, others were selectively excluded, not out of malice, I think, but convenience. She decided what mattered based on what supported the version of the family she liked best. I only noticed because of a comment my aunt made months after the shift in power. She mentioned a letter she remembered vividly, something my father had written during that missing year, something about choosing responsibility over certainty. She couldn't find it anymore. That sentence stuck with me. I didn't accuse my sister of losing anything. I didn't ask directly. I simply offered to help locate the records, framing it as care for legacy. By then, no one objected to my involvement. That alone was telling. What I found wasn't explosive. It wasn't scandalous. It was worse. Patterns, letters my father had written but never sent, notes to himself, reflections that showed a man grappling with truth, obligation, and love in ways my sister had never acknowledged. He wrote about me, not often but deliberately. He questioned whether blood was the right metric for family. He worried about imbalance, about favoritism, about the kind of harm that comes from convenience. And he wrote about my sister too, not cruelly. Honestly, he noted her competence and her hunger, her need to be central, her tendency to control narratives rather than confront them. He worried that giving her too much unchecked authority would distort things over time. Reading those words didn't feel like vindication. It felt like confirmation of something I'd always sensed but never articulated. My father had seen us clearly, he just hadn't known how to fix what he'd helped create. Here's the part my sister never anticipated. When those records were reviewed collaboratively, quietly, it became clear that the omissions weren't random. They consistently removed context that complicated her image. No one accused her of manipulation. They didn't need to. The pattern spoke for itself. Trust didn't shatter, it finalized its departure. From that point on, she wasn't just sidelined. She was excluded from stewardship entirely, not punished, relieved. The family reframed it as protecting her from stress, a kindness, one she couldn't refuse without sounding defensive. She asked me once if I'd known those letters existed. I said, truthfully, I suspected. That answer haunted her more than any accusation ever could, because suspicion implies observation, and observation implies time. And time implies intention. What she finally understood too late was that I hadn't waited passively for justice. I'd been present, consistent, watching, letting her define herself through choices she assumed would never be revisited. The cruelest part of this kind of revenge isn't exposure, it's permanence. She couldn't undo what had been seen. She couldn't argue with patterns. She couldn't reinsert herself into a role that now required a level of restraint she'd never practiced. And I didn't have to do anything else. Next, I'll tell you how she tried one last time to regain leverage, not publicly, not loudly, but personally, and why that attempt failed in the most decisive way possible. When people lose public power, they often retreat to personal leverage. Old bonds, shared history, emotional shortcuts they've relied on for years. My sister did exactly that. She called late one evening, voice softened, edges sanded down. No performance this time, no audience. She asked if she could come by, said she just wanted to talk, said it felt strange that we'd never really talked like sisters. That word, sisters, landed carefully. Strategically, I agreed. Not because I wanted reconciliation and not because I was curious what she'd say. I agreed because I wanted to see which version of herself she'd choose when there was nothing left to protect her. She arrived without her usual armor, no polished outfit, no practiced smile. She sat across from me and looked around my place, really looked like she was finally registering that I'd built a life without her approval. That alone unsettled her. She started with regret, not apology, regret. She said she wished things hadn't gone so far. She said she never meant to hurt me with the DNA test. She said it was supposed to be light-hearted. That word again, as if humiliation ever is. I listened. I always did. Then she pivoted. She talked about how families forgive, how blood still matters. How outsiders wouldn't understand our dynamics the way we did. She reminded me of childhood moments I'd nearly forgotten, selectively, warmly. She was rebuilding proximity, trying to reestablish a private alliance where she could negotiate terms. Finally, she made her offer. She said if I helped smooth things out, if I spoke up for her, clarified intentions, reassured people, she'd make sure I was taken care of, not threatened. Promised? The way people do when they think generosity will disguise control. That was the moment I felt something close to satisfaction, not because she was desperate, but because she still didn't see me. She thought I wanted compensation, she thought I wanted inclusion, she thought my silence had been waiting for a payoff. In her mind, everything had a price because everything had always been priced by her. I told her no, just that, calm. Unembellished, she blinked, tried again, reframed, emphasized fairness, emphasized family, emphasized how hard this had been for her. Each sentence centered herself more than the last. I let her finish. Then I told her something she wasn't prepared to hear. I don't need anything from you, I said, and I don't want anything back. That sentence broke the negotiation, because negotiations only work when both sides need something. The moment she realized I didn't, the last illusion of leverage evaporated. You could see it in her posture, the way her shoulders tensed, the way her voice lost its modulation. She asked why I was doing this. I answered honestly. I'm not doing anything I stopped doing. That was the cruelest truth of all. I wasn't punishing her. I wasn't plotting anymore. I was done. The system had adjusted. The consequences were in motion without me. And nothing terrifies controlling people more than irrelevance. She left not angry, but unmoored. After that, she stopped reaching out, not because she accepted the outcome, but because she understood something final had happened. She couldn't bargain her way back into a position that no longer existed. And I felt light, not victorious, not righteous, just free, because the revenge wasn't in denying her help. It was in showing her that I'd never needed her to begin with. Next, I'll tell you how that realization reshaped the entire family, not dramatically, not loudly, but permanently, and why some truths don't explode, they settle. Families don't collapse all at once. They recalibrate. Like old houses after a storm, they creak, shift, and eventually settle into a structure that looks familiar but feels different underfoot. After my sister's visit, no one announced a turning point. There was no family meeting, no collective agreement, but patterns changed, and patterns are how families tell the truth when words fail. Conversations slowed down. People listened more carefully, especially when I spoke. That was new, not dramatic, just noticeable. When I offered an opinion, it wasn't brushed aside or gently overridden, it was considered, sometimes adopted. That subtle acknowledgement felt heavier than applause. My mother adapted in quiet ways. She stopped trying to mediate. She stopped reframing the past. Instead, she asked questions, real ones, about my life, my work, my plans. At first, the questions felt awkward, like she was learning a new language, but over time they softened. Curiosity replaced correction. She never apologized directly. I didn't need her to. Understanding can be more sincere than regret when it's consistent. Extended family members adjusted too. I was included earlier in decisions, consulted rather than informed. Trusted with details that once would have flowed automatically to my sister. No one explained the shift out loud. They didn't have to. Everyone could feel where stability lived now. My sister watched it happen from the edges. She still attended gatherings, but she no longer dominated them. She spoke, but people didn't rearrange themselves around her words. When she left rooms, conversations didn't pause. That absence of impact unsettled her more than outright rejection ever could. And here's the thing she never anticipated. No one was cruel to her. They were polite, kind even, but they were no longer persuaded by her. Politeness without influence is a strange kind of isolation. It looks normal from the outside, but it starves you slowly. As for me, I didn't step into her old role. That would have been a mistake. Instead, I occupied a new one, quieter, steadier. I became a reference point, someone people checked with, someone whose silence meant something. That role came with responsibility. I learned when to speak and when to let things resolve on their own. I learned that influence isn't about winning, it's about shaping outcomes so they no longer need you present to continue. My father had understood that, too late perhaps. But clearly, one evening my aunt said something that stayed with me. She told me, "Your dad would have liked how things turned out." She didn't elaborate, she didn't need to. That single sentence felt like a closing of a loop that had been open my entire life. My sister didn't reach out again, not directly, but I heard through others that she was struggling, not financially, not socially in any dramatic way, but existentially. She didn't know who she was without centrality, without default trust, without the assumption that she'd be believed first. That's a hard loss to process, especially when you never thought it was something you could lose. I didn't feel responsible for her adjustment. That might sound cold, but it's honest. Accountability without cruelty still hurts, sometimes more deeply than punishment. Because it leaves no villain to fight, no injustice to rally against. The DNA test that was meant to humiliate me had done the opposite. It had stripped away illusions, not just about lineage, but about worth. About who holds families together when performance fades. And now, with the past finally rearranged, there was only one thing left to confront: the future. Because when power shifts quietly, it leaves behind an empty space. And empty spaces invite decisions. Next, I'll tell you about the choice I had to make, the one that would define who I became after all of this, and why restraint turned out to be the most ruthless option of all. Once the family settled into its new rhythm, something unexpected happened. People started looking to me for direction. Not overtly, not with formal requests. Just small, consequential moments, pauses in conversation, glances after questions were asked, that subtle wait to see how I'd react before others decided how to proceed. Power like that is dangerous if you rush it. I could have filled the space loudly, claimed authority, rewritten the family narrative with myself at the center this time. People would have accepted it, maybe even welcomed it. That's the temptation after being ignored for so long, to finally be seen and overcorrect. I didn't. Instead, I chose restraint. That choice confused my sister more than anything else I'd done. She expected retaliation, replacement. Some grand reversal where I became what she used to be. When that didn't happen, she couldn't orient herself. You can compete with a rival. You can't compete with a vacuum that refuses to be filled. I limited my involvement intentionally. I declined roles that mirrored her old position. I redirected decisions back to groups instead of individuals. I emphasized process over personality. That shift ensured no one could ever centralize power the way she had again. And here's where the cruelty lived. By making the system healthier, I made her obsolete permanently. She couldn't accuse me of sabotage. I wasn't taking anything from her. I was simply removing the conditions that had allowed her to dominate. No drama, no confrontation, just evolution. I saw the moment she understood this. It happened at a small gathering, nothing formal. She tried to assert an opinion the way she always had, expecting the room to tilt toward her. It didn't. Someone thanked her and moved on. Another person suggested a different approach. No one argued, no one deferred. She went quiet. That silence wasn't imposed, it was earned. Later, she caught my eye across the room. There was something raw there, not anger, not sadness, recognition. She finally saw that even if she regained trust, even if she repaired every relationship, the structure itself no longer supported her old role. And that was irreversible. People often think revenge is about balance, pain for pain, humiliation for humiliation. It isn't. True revenge is asymmetry. It's changing the rules so thoroughly that the game someone mastered no longer exists. I slept better after that, not because I'd won, but because I'd finished. There was nothing left to prove, nothing left to extract. The future was mine to shape without reference to her shadow. The irony is this. If she'd never given me that DNA test, none of this would have happened. I would have stayed quiet, peripheral, useful but unseen. She mistook silence for absence, patience for weakness. That mistake cost her everything she valued most. Legacy isn't what you inherit. It's what remains after people stop protecting you. Next, I'll tell you how the inheritance itself finally resolved, not in numbers or documents, but in meaning, and why the ending no one talks about mattered more than any financial outcome. People assume inheritance is about assets, amounts, percentages, who got what and who didn't. That's the part outsiders fixate on because numbers feel concrete, clean, easy to measure, but that wasn't where the real resolution happened. By the time the practical details were finalized, the emotional outcome had already been decided. The redistribution wasn't dramatic. No one was cut off, no one was crowned. The structure was simply balanced. Checks where there hadn't been any before, shared responsibility where control used to live. And somehow that balance spoke louder than any unequal division ever could. My sister received what she was entitled to, nothing more, nothing less. On paper, it looked fair, but fairness feels different when it's no longer reinforced by trust. Every benefit she kept now came with limits, oversight, shared visibility, the kind of conditions she once considered beneath her. I, on the other hand, didn't receive anything extraordinary financially. That surprised some people. They expected a reversal, a correction for years of being overlooked. But I didn't ask for one, I didn't need it. What I received was influence without obligation. I was asked to help guide long-term decisions, to weigh in on preservation rather than extraction, to protect, not control. Those invitations mattered more than any figure attached to a document. They meant people trusted my judgment even when nothing was at stake. That trust was the inheritance. My mother noticed the difference first. She told me one afternoon quietly that she felt relieved. She didn't elaborate, she didn't have to. Relief comes when chaos stops pretending to be leadership. My sister struggled most during this phase. Not outwardly, she was careful now, but internally. She tried to frame the outcome as acceptable, even positive. But she couldn't escape the fact that she was now managed instead of managing, accountable instead of autonomous. That shift bruised her in ways no confrontation ever could. The DNA test that was meant to define me had done the opposite. It had redefined everyone else's assumptions. Blood hadn't decided belonging, behavior had, consistency had. Restraint had. I visited my father's grave alone after everything settled. No ceremony, no speech, just quiet. I told him the truth he'd never asked for, that I was okay. That I understood now why he'd been distant, why he'd tried to balance love and obligation without ever resolving the tension. I thanked him for choosing me in the ways he could. That choice echoed louder than biology. When I left, I didn't feel closure in the dramatic sense. I felt alignment, like my life had finally clicked into a position it had always been moving toward, just slowly. My sister never mentioned the DNA test again. Not once. Some things become too heavy to joke about once you understand their weight. And I realized something important. The most cruel revenge isn't taking something away. It's becoming someone they can no longer dismiss, manipulate, or define. Because once that happens, the past loses its leverage. Next, I'll tell you about the final shift, the moment I realized this story wasn't about revenge anymore, but about authorship, and how choosing what came next became the most powerful act of all. There's a strange moment that comes after everything settles when you realize you're no longer reacting. For most of my life, even my patience had been a response, a way of surviving someone else's gravity. But after the inheritance resolved and the family found its new equilibrium, that gravity disappeared, and I had to decide who I was without it. That question unsettles people more than conflict ever does. Conflict gives you direction. It sharpens you, it tells you where to stand. Peace, real peace, demands something harder. Choice. I noticed the change in myself first. I stopped replaying conversations in my head, stopped anticipating my sister's moves, stopped wondering how I'd be perceived in rooms where I'd once felt small. My energy, which had been coiled for years, suddenly had nowhere to aim outward, so I aimed it forward. I began saying no more often. Not defensively, decisively. I declined roles that didn't align with where I was going. I stepped away from dynamics that required me to shrink for the comfort of others. That included family expectations I'd once absorbed without question. No one argued with me. That was the strangest part. Authority once earned quietly doesn't require explanation. My sister watched this shift with something like disbelief. She'd assumed that once the dust settled, I'd relax back into my old shape, that I'd drift toward the margins again now that there was nothing left to fight for. She didn't understand that the fight had never been the point. The point had been clarity, without resistance to push against. Her own life felt unstructured. She struggled to define goals that didn't involve comparison or control. She still succeeded by conventional standards: work, social life, appearances, but something essential was missing. She no longer knew who she was performing for. I didn't try to help her find that answer. That would have put me back in a role I'd already outgrown. Instead, I focused on building things that didn't depend on approval, long-term projects, commitments that required patience rather than validation. I chose work that rewarded consistency over charisma. The same traits that had once made me invisible now made me effective. People began to seek me out for reasons unrelated to family. That mattered. It meant my identity had finally detached from its origin story. One afternoon, my mother asked me if I thought things would ever be normal again. I told her the truth: they already are. Just not the version we memorized. She nodded, slowly, as if accepting that normal isn't something you return to, it's something you rebuild. I thought about the DNA test then. About how a single gesture meant to humiliate me had forced everyone to confront truths they'd avoided for decades. My sister had wanted to expose me. Instead, she'd exposed the fragility of the story she relied on. And I'd let that exposure do its work without ever raising my voice. That's when it hit me: revenge had been the catalyst, not the destination. The real power was authorship, deciding what this story meant and where it ended. I wasn't the overlooked daughter anymore. I wasn't the quiet counterweight to someone else's excess. I was the narrator now, of my life, of my choices, of what came next. And when you reach that point, you don't need to punish anyone. They've already lost the ability to define you. Next, I'll tell you about the last time my sister tested the boundary, a small moment that confirmed everything had truly changed, and why it finally closed the door on the past for good. The last moment between my sister and me wasn't dramatic. No raised voices, no ultimatums. That's how I knew it was the last one. It happened months later at a casual family event, nothing symbolic, nothing loaded on the surface. Just food, familiar faces, routine conversations. The kind of gathering where old habits sometimes try to sneak back in when people think no one's paying attention. She approached me while others were distracted. Her tone was light, almost nostalgic. She commented on how far we'd both come, how everything worked out in the end. On its own, that would have been harmless, but then she added one small line almost as an afterthought. I guess none of this would have happened if you hadn't taken that test. There it was, the rewrite. She wasn't accusing me outright. She was reframing causality, nudging responsibility back onto me, testing whether I'd accept it the way I used to. For a split second, she watched my face, waiting to see if the old reflex would kick in. The one where I softened things, smoothed edges, took on blame to keep peace. It didn't. I smiled politely, calmly. I took the test you gave me, I said. What happened after that wasn't my decision. I didn't say it sharply, I didn't say it defensively. I said it like a fact, the way you'd correct a date or a name, something non-negotiable. She paused, just long enough. That pause told me everything. She understood then that the boundary wasn't emotional anymore. It wasn't fragile. It wasn't something she could cross by implication or familiarity. It was structural, solid, Permanent? She nodded and changed the subject. No tension, no fallout, but the attempt mattered more than the outcome, because it confirmed that even now she still reached for control when she felt uncertain. And it confirmed something else just as important: I no longer absorbed it. After that, our interactions settled into something distant but civil, cordial, predictable. She stopped probing, stopped reframing, stopped trying to negotiate meaning. The door hadn't been slammed, it had been closed carefully with intention. That's the kind of ending people don't talk about, not explosive, not satisfying in the cinematic sense, but complete. I realized then that she would carry her version of this story forever, one where circumstances betrayed her, where outcomes were unfair, where control slipped for reasons she'd never fully name. And I would carry mine, grounded, accurate, unburdened. Those two versions no longer needed to intersect. The revenge was finished not when she lost influence, but when she lost access to my reactions, to my guilt, to my silence as a tool she could use. When people can no longer move you emotionally, they lose their final leverage, and that's when the past stops reaching into the present. Next, I'll give you the true ending, not just what happened, but what it means, and leave you with the line that carried me through all of it. I used to think endings were moments, big ones. Conversations that wrapped everything up neatly like a bow on a box you could put away and never open again. That's not how real endings work. Real endings are quieter. They arrive one ordinary day when you realize something no longer hurts. When a memory that once tightened your chest now feels like a story you heard about someone else. When the past loses its authority to interrupt your present. That's how this ended for me, not with forgiveness, that word gets used too easily, but with understanding. I understood who my sister was, and more importantly, who she wasn't capable of being. I understood my parents' failures without excusing them. I understood my father's silence without romanticizing it. And I understood myself. The DNA test that was meant to humiliate me didn't reveal my worth. It revealed how fragile other people's power was when it depended on keeping someone else small. My sister needed me to stay underestimated because her confidence was built in comparison. The moment I stopped playing that role, her certainty collapsed under its own weight. What she lost wasn't money, it wasn't status, it was narrative control. She no longer got to decide who I was, why I belonged, or how the story would be told. And once that control was gone, everything else followed naturally. People often ask what the cruel part of revenge was in all of this. It wasn't exposure. It wasn't humiliation. It wasn't watching her struggle to regain ground. It was this: I became undeniable. I didn't shout. I didn't demand. I didn't punish. I simply stepped fully into my life, my voice, my authority, and let the world adjust around that reality. For someone who built her identity on being the default, that adjustment was unbearable. My inheritance wasn't money or property, it was something rarer: permanence, the kind that doesn't need defending. The kind that remains even when people stop paying attention. I still live quietly, I still move carefully. Those traits were never weaknesses, they were training. I don't announce my power because I don't need to. It shows up in outcomes, not performances. And if there's one thing I want you to take from this story, it's this: never underestimate the person who stays calm while being laughed at. They're not weak, they're watching. And when they finally move, they don't flip the table, they replace it. That's the truth my sister learned too late, and that's the truth that set me free.